foundation of voting rights in the United States can be traced back to the principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence on August 2nd, 1776. Thomas Jefferson's famous line, "Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed," framed the idea that the legitimate political power must come from the people, a concept that underlines democratic voting rights. However, when the U.S. Constitution was adopted 12 years later in 1788, it left power-setting voting requirements largely left to the states. This meant that, in practice, voting was initially limited to white, property-owning men over the age of 21. And Article 2 of the Constitution also established the Electoral College, further distancing direct popular influence in presidential elections.
The post-Civil War amendments brought major constitutional changes to voting and citizenship. The 14th Amendment, ratified on July 9, 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved people, and promised equal protection under the laws. This amendment laid a critical foundation for future legal challenges to discriminatory voting laws. 2 years later, the 15th Amendment was ratified on February 3, 1870, prohibiting the denial of the right to vote based on race. However, states, particularly in the South, responded with poll taxes, literacy tests, and other tactics that effectively suppressed voting until the mid-20th century.
On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment extended the right to vote to women, marking a monumental achievement for the women's suffrage movement. Still, many women of color remained disfranchised due to discriminatory state laws. Then, on June 2, 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act granted Native Americans U.S. citizenship and the right to vote, although some states continued to prevent them from voting through legal loopholes and intimidation. In 1943, the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act allowed Chinese immigrants and their families to naturalize and vote, marking the first time Asian Americans could fully participate in the democratic process.
Districts did not always have the right to vote in the United States. The 23rd Amendment, ratified on March 29, 1961, gave residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote in presidential elections, expanding federal electoral access. Now, just 3 years later, on January 23, 1964, the 24th Amendment banned poll taxes in federal elections, striking a blow to one of the tools used to suppress the poor and minority voters. This set the stage for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The act banned literacy tests, empowered the federal oversight in areas with history of discrimination, and allowed federal officers to register voters. The Supreme Court upheld its constitutionality in a series of rulings, reinforcing Congress's power to enforce the 15th Amendment.
In 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18, largely in response to the Vietnam War, acknowledging that young Americans old enough to be drafted should also have the right to vote. The 1975 amendments to the Voting Rights Act further expanded protections by requiring jurisdictions with large non-English speaking populations to provide bilingual voting materials. The act was extended again in 1982 under President Ronald Reagan, and new law in 1984 required polling places to be accessible for people with disabilities and the elderly.
Voting access expanded further in 1993 with the National Voter Registration Act, also known as the Motor Voter Law, which made it easier to register to vote through DMVs and public agencies. The Help America Vote Act of 2002, signed by President George W. Bush, followed the chaotic 2000 election and modernized voting systems, improved equipment, and created a national voting guidance body.
However, voting rights protections faced a significant rollback on June 25, 2013, with the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder. The court invalidated Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, which determined which jurisdictions required federal oversight before changing voting laws. The ruling argued that the formula was outdated, but its practical effect was swift and profound. Within months, many states enacted new restrictive laws, including voter ID requirements, polling place closures, and limits on early voting, many of which disproportionately affected minority communities.
At first, the Jim Crow laws created this sense of racial segregation. This started after the Civil War and lasted until around 1968. Jim Crow forced southern states to segregate when it came to schooling, transportation, restrooms, etc. This created the suppression of African American rights. These actions were in the form of literacy tests and members of the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK, leading to lynchings. This led to the civil rights movement led by MLK Jr. and Rosa Parks, who finally brought about a change.
However, even in the good, there is also a lot of possible bad. When the 14th Amendment was ratified after the Civil War, it led to the groundwork for the future. However, many did not see it as such. They thought of many loopholes that started Jim Crow laws. But this is not just circling the bad part of the past when talking about the 14th Amendment. Looking at the positive, it challenged many mainstream practices in the South, allowing the slaves to deal with a sense of backlash, but at the same time empowering them with knowing most of their freedoms. Then came in Martin Luther King to make the mass expansion of civil rights listed in the 14th Amendment.
When the civil rights movement came to an end, it brought along a lot more changes. Although the 14th Amendment was around for some time before the Jim Crow laws, which led to the segregation and persecution of African Americans and other ethnicities. However, after MLK's speech, these Americans saw a fresh new beginning, and this was seen in the electoral practices, mainly voting. In the past, many would have to go through multiple tests to figure out if they were eligible. They also got rid of the 3/5 rule and finally went to one person, one vote principle seen through the Equal Protection Clause. States also abolished the idea of qualifying for voting.
Civic action has been essential to shaping democracy in the United States. From marching to legal battles, ordinary people have pushed for justice and expanded rights. The women's suffrage movement used protests, parades, and petitions to fight for the right to vote, resulting in the 19th Amendment in 1920. Similarly, the civil rights movement saw powerful actions like the Selma to Montgomery marches, leading to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which protected Black Americans from voter suppression.
Young people also made an impact during the Vietnam War era, arguing that if they were old enough to be drafted at 18, they should be allowed to vote. Their activism helped pass the 26th Amendment, lowering the voting age. Native Americans also fought for political inclusion as well, leading to the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which granted them voting rights, though enforcement varied by state.
Other key forms of civic action include the Montgomery bus boycott and the Greensboro sit-ins, which challenged segregation through peaceful protest. Petitions, letter-writing campaigns, and court challenges like Brown v. Board of Education have also driven change. Local community organizing has empowered people to address shared concerns, and in modern times, only online activism through movements like hashtag Black Lives Matter have mobilized millions and influenced policy.
In every era, civic action has proven that democracy depends on engaged citizens who speak out, organize, and demand a more just and equal society. Voting rights in the United States are deeply connected to several key constitutional protections, particularly the Equal Protection Clause, Due Process Clause, and Citizenship Clause, all found in the 14th Amendment. Each plays a vital role in ensuring that the right to vote is applied fairly and equally across the country.
The Equal Protection Clause states that the government must treat all people equally under the law. This clause has been essential in striking down voting laws and practices that discriminate based on race, ethnicity, or other classifications. For example, in Harper v. Virginia Board of Education elections, the Supreme Court ruled that the poll taxes were unconstitutional because they unfairly targeted poor voters. Similarly, in Bush v. Gore, The court used equal protection arguments to address inconsistent voting counting practices. The Equal Protection Clause also supports the principle of one person, one vote, established in Reynolds v. Sims, which requires legislative districts to have roughly equal populations so that every person's vote carries equal weight. Courts also use this clause to evaluate whether voting procedures like ID requirements or polling place closures, unfairly burdening certain groups.
The Due Process Clause ensures that no person is deprived of life, liberty, or property without fair legal procedures. While the Constitution doesn't explicitly guarantee a universal right to vote, the Supreme Court has recognized that voting is a fundamental right. Because of this, any law that restricts voting must be fair, not arbitrary, and must provide legal safeguards. For instance, in the Harper case, the court not only cited equal protection, but also emphasized that denying the right to vote without fair process violates the due process principles. If a state purges voters from registration rolls without proper notice or sets up barriers to voting without justification, these actions can be challenged under the Due Process Clause.
Go.
Finally, the Citizenship Clause lays the foundation for voting rights by defining who qualifies as a citizen. It declares that anyone born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen. This clause became especially important after the Civil War, as it granted formerly enslaved people to full citizenship, which was a crucial first step towards securing their right to vote through the later amendments like the 15th. Being a U.S. citizen is the first requirement for voting eligibility. Without this clause, millions of people wouldn't even be recognized as a part of a political community and would have no opportunity to participate in elections or advocate for their very important rights. Together, these three constitutional procedures ensure that voting in the United States is not just a privilege, but a protected right that must also be applied equally, fairly, and with respect to all citizens.